But nothing, absolutely nothing, could have prepared him for walking into his own kitchen and finding his 6-year-old daughter on her hands and knees, desperately licking cat litter from a pet bowl, while the woman he trusted most in the world stood watching with cold satisfaction. Staff Sergeant Thaddeus Thad Blackwood had counted every single day of his 3-year deployment, 1,095 days away from home, 1,095 days of wondering if his daughter Serafina still remembered his voice. At 32, Thad was Special Forces with commendations and scars that told stories he'd never share. His hands, calloused from handling weapons, were surprisingly gentle when he'd video-called Sarah. Those same hands now trembled slightly as he approached the house he'd left behind. The deployment to Afghanistan had been extended twice. What was supposed to be 18 months became 3 years. Every night he'd stare at that photo of Sarah, her gap-toothed smile, her wild curly hair, her bright eyes that held all the wonder in the world. While other soldiers talked about bars and women, Thad talked about bedtime stories and bicycle rides. His battle-hardened exterior concealed a father's heart that ached with every missed birthday, every holiday spent in a foxhole instead of at home. Serafina Blackwood had been 4 when her daddy left. She was 7 now, though she looked smaller, frailer, quieter, with eyes that had seen too much. Before Daddy left, Sarah had been the neighborhood's sunshine. She'd race her pink bicycle down the sidewalk, her laughter echoing off houses. She'd collect ladybugs in mason jars and demand elaborate funeral services when they died. Her room had been an explosion of color, purple walls with butterfly stickers, shelves lined with stuffed animals. She'd had tea parties with her dolls, complete with serious discussions about which bear needed more sugar. Sarah had inherited her father's stubborn streak and her late mother's gentle spirit. She was the kind of child who would share her Halloween candy, who would cry if she stepped on an ant. Her teachers called her an old soul. The little girl who now sat in shadows was a ghost of that vibrant child. The memories hit Thad like shrapnel. This place had once been filled with so much joy. Saturday mornings had been their special time. Thad would wake to find Sarah beside his bed, holding her favorite book. "Daddy, read about the Dragon Princess," she'd whisper. They'd spend hours reading, Sarah making up her own endings to stories. In the kitchen, they'd make daddy-daughter pancakes, a disaster of flour and giggles. Sarah would stand on a chair, carefully cracking eggs and announcing each ingredient. "Now we add the magic flour, Daddy," usually getting more on herself than in the bowl. Their Sunday adventures were legendary. Thad would pack a picnic, and they'd explore trails, having elaborate conversations about everything from why grass was green to whether clouds had feelings. The house had been filled with Sarah's artwork, crayon drawings of stick figures under rainbow skies. Her laugh had been the soundtrack of their home. Those memories felt like they belonged to someone else's life now. The deployment order came on a Tuesday. Sarah had just started preschool and was excited about her new friend Mia and the classroom hamster. The envelope felt heavier than it should have. 18 months in Afghanistan, possibly extended. His country needed him. The timing was devastating. Just 6 months after Sarah's mother had died in a car accident. Thad stared at those orders for hours, wrestling with an impossible choice. He was a soldier, but he was also a father whose little girl had already lost her mother. His commanding officer called, "Blackwood, we need our best. This isn't optional." That night, Thad sat Sarah down in her bedroom. "Daddy has to go help some people far away," he said steadily. "For how long?" she asked, her small hand finding his. "A while, baby girl, but I'll come back. I promise I'll always come back to you." Victoria Harrington seemed like an answer to prayer. She'd been Thad's friend since high school, was unmarried, worked from home, and had always been great with kids. Most importantly, Sarah knew and trusted her. "Uncle Vic always brings the best cookies," Sarah had said when Thad suggested the arrangement. "I'd love to help," Victoria said, her smile warm and reassuring. "Sarah and I will have so much fun. Don't worry about anything, Thad. She'll be safe with me." Victoria's house was perfect, a 2-story colonial with a big backyard. She'd prepared a room for Sarah, painted yellow with white furniture. The paperwork was straightforward. Victoria would be Sarah's legal guardian with access to $2,500 monthly for Sarah's care. "She's like the daughter I never had," Victoria said at the airport, hugging Sarah as Thad prepared to leave. For the first year, everything seemed fine. The changes started small, so small that even if Thad had been there, he might have missed them at first. It began with Victoria's tone when she thought no one was listening. The sweet, patient voice she used during video calls would shift to something sharper when she was talking to Sarah off camera. "Move faster," she'd snap. "Stop being so slow." The art supplies in Sarah's room began disappearing one by one. First, the expensive colored pencils, then the watercolor set. Finally, even the basic crayons. When Sarah asked about them, Victoria would say they were being cleaned or put away for safekeeping. The movie nights stopped. The baking sessions ended. The bedtime stories became a thing of the past. Sarah's questions about when Daddy would call were met with increasingly irritated responses. "Your father is busy," Victoria would say, not looking up from her computer. "Stop bothering me about it." The monthly allowance that was supposed to provide for Sarah's needs began funding Victoria's wants instead. New clothes appeared in Victoria's closet, while Sarah's clothes grew tighter and more worn. Victoria's kitchen filled with expensive foods while Sarah's portions grew smaller. But it was the day Victoria bought herself a new laptop with Sarah's clothing money that something fundamental shifted in the house. Victoria looked at the little girl sitting quietly at the kitchen table, and instead of seeing Thad's daughter, she saw an inconvenience, an expense, a burden she was stuck with for 2 more years. That night, for the first time, Sarah went to bed hungry. Victoria told herself it was because the child hadn't finished her vegetables, but deep down she knew it was because she could. The systematic cruelty began slowly, like water finding cracks in stone. Victoria discovered that emotional manipulation left fewer marks. She began telling Sarah that Thad had called but didn't want to talk to her. He said, "You've been a bad girl." Victoria would lie, watching the light dim in Sarah's eyes. The lies grew elaborate. Thad was staying in Afghanistan forever. He'd found a new family. He'd forgotten his daughter. Each lie killed pieces of the joyful child Sarah had been. Physical neglect followed. Sarah's portions shrank, while Victoria's meals grew elaborate. The little girl learned not to ask for seconds, not to complain when her stomach cramped with hunger. Then came the day Victoria brought home cat litter and a metal bowl. "Since you want to act like an animal," Victoria said casually, "you can eat like one." When Sarah refused, Victoria shrugged, "Then you don't eat at all." The child lasted until the second day, before desperation drove her to taste the clay pellets. They were dusty, chalky, horrible, but they filled the gnawing emptiness. Victoria watched with satisfaction as the proud, spirited child slowly broke down into something timid and hollow. This wasn't about caring anymore. This was about power and the sick pleasure of destroying something beautiful. Mrs. Eleanor Patterson lived next door and had raised 4 children of her own. But something about the Harrington house bothered her. She noticed that Sarah, who used to wave enthusiastically from the backyard, had stopped appearing outside altogether. The child's bicycle sat forgotten in the garage, gathering dust. During brief encounters at the mailbox, Mrs. Patterson observed troubling changes. Sarah had grown thinner, quieter, more withdrawn. Her clothes hung loose, and she had a nervous habit of looking over her shoulder. "How are you doing, sweetheart?" Mrs. Patterson asked one afternoon. "I'm fine," Sarah whispered, but her eyes darted toward the house where Victoria's silhouette was visible. "I have to go inside now." At school, Miss Jennifer Collins had her own concerns. The bright child who'd started first grade had become increasingly withdrawn. Sarah no longer participated in discussions and often seemed to be listening for something others couldn't hear. Most troubling were Sarah's eating habits. She would devour her school lunch with urgency, suggesting she wasn't getting enough food at home. When Miss Collins offered extra snacks, Sarah would refuse, saying she wasn't allowed to take food home. Phone calls to Victoria were met with smooth explanations. "Sarah's just adjusting to her father being away," Victoria would say. "She's always been sensitive. I'm doing everything I can to help her." 3,000 miles away, in a forward operating base that smelled of diesel fuel and desert dust, Thad began experiencing what his fellow soldiers called the knowing, that inexplicable sense that something was wrong at home. It started with the video calls. Victoria had been regular about scheduling them for the first year, but lately they'd become sporadic. When they did happen, Sarah seemed different, quieter, smaller somehow, even through the pixelated screen of military internet. "How's my princess doing?" Thad would ask, his heart aching at the sight of his daughter's face. "I'm okay, Daddy," Sarah would whisper, but she wouldn't meet his eyes through the camera. She'd gotten thinner. He was sure of it, though Victoria insisted she was just growing up and losing her baby fat. The conversations felt stilted, unnatural. Victoria would hover just off camera, and Sarah would glance in her direction before answering any of Thad's questions. The spontaneous chatter that had characterized their earlier calls, Sarah's excited stories about friends, activities, dreams, had dried up completely. Most disturbing were the lies, small ones at first. Sarah would mention a field trip that Victoria later said never happened. She'd talk about a book they'd read together, but when Thad asked Victoria about it privately, she'd claim ignorance. The monthly financial reports Victoria sent were another source of growing concern. The receipts she provided seemed reasonable on the surface: groceries, clothing, school supplies, but something felt off about the amounts. $300 for groceries seemed excessive for one adult and one small child, especially when Sarah appeared to be losing weight. Thad's requests for additional photos were met with excuses. Victoria's phone was broken. Sarah was shy about pictures lately. The lighting in the house wasn't good. Always something. Late at night, when the desert wind howled through the camp and his fellow soldiers slept, Thad would stare at that photo of Sarah, the one with her gap-toothed grin and sparkly dress from her 5th birthday party. Something was wrong. Every instinct he'd developed as a soldier, every protective impulse he possessed as a father, was screaming that his daughter was in danger. The breaking point came during what would be their last video call. Sarah appeared on screen looking so thin and frail that Thad's heart clenched. Her hair, once a glorious crown of curls, hung limp and dull. But it was her eyes that destroyed him. Hollow, haunted, like the eyes of refugees he'd seen in war zones. "Daddy," she whispered, glancing nervously off camera. "When are you coming home?" "Soon, baby girl," Thad promised, though his deployment wasn't scheduled to end for another 8 months. "Daddy's going to come home real soon." Something flickered in Sarah's eyes. Hope, maybe, or desperation. She opened her mouth as if to say something more, but Victoria's voice cut through from off camera. "Time's up, Sarah. Say goodbye to your father." The call ended abruptly, leaving Thad staring at a black screen and feeling like his world had just tilted off its axis. That night, he made the call that would change everything. His commanding officer, Colonel Martinez, listened as Thad explained his concerns. The man had daughters of his own and understood the desperation in Thad's voice. "I need emergency leave," Thad said. "Something's wrong with my daughter. I can feel it." "You've got 3 commendations and flawless service record," Colonel Martinez replied after a long pause. "Consider it done. Get home, Blackwood. Trust your gut." The next morning, Thad was on a transport plane heading stateside, carrying nothing but his duffel bag and a growing certainty that he was racing against time to save his daughter's life. Thad's key still worked in Victoria's front door. He'd called ahead to let her know he was coming, but she'd said she'd be out running errands with Sarah. "What a wonderful surprise," she'd said, her voice bright and cheerful. "We'll be back around 6. Can't wait to see you." It was 4:30 when Thad quietly entered the house. The silence hit him first. This house, which should have been filled with the sounds of childhood, television, cartoons, music, laughter, was as quiet as a tomb. He moved through the living room, noting how pristine everything looked, how untouched. There were no toys visible, no child's artwork on the refrigerator, no signs that a 7-year-old lived here. Then he heard it, a soft whimpering sound coming from the kitchen. Thad followed the sound, his heart pounding with a rhythm he recognized from approaching enemy positions. Every step felt like walking through quicksand, time stretching impossibly as his mind tried to process what his ears were telling him. The kitchen doorway framed a scene that would haunt his nightmares forever. Serafina, his beautiful, spirited daughter, was on her hands and knees on the cold tile floor. Her clothes hung off her skeletal frame like fabric draped over a scarecrow. Her hair was matted and dirty, but it was what she was doing that shattered his soul into a million pieces. She was eating cat litter from a metal pet bowl, her small hands trembling as she picked up the clay pellets and forced them into her mouth. Tears streamed down her hollow cheeks as she chewed the horrible stuff, gagging but continuing to eat because hunger was stronger than revulsion. Victoria stood nearby, checking her phone with the casual indifference of someone watching paint dry. When she looked up and saw Thad in the doorway, her face went through a series of expressions: surprise, fear, and then a calculating coldness that revealed who she really was. "Thad," she said, her voice artificially bright. "You're early." Sarah was just cleaning up a mess she made. But Sarah had heard his voice. The little girl's head snapped up, and when she saw her father standing there, the pet bowl fell from her hands with a metallic clatter. For a moment, neither of them moved, both frozen in a tableau of horror and recognition. "Daddy," Sarah whispered, her voice barely audible. "Is it really you?" Thad dropped to his knees on the kitchen floor, his arms opening wide. "Yes, baby girl. Daddy's here now." Sarah launched herself into his arms with what little strength she had left, her tiny body shaking with sobs that seemed too big for her frail frame. As Thad held his daughter, feeling how light she'd become, how fragile, his eyes met Victoria's over Sarah's head. The mask was completely off now. Victoria's face showed no remorse, no shame, only irritation at being caught and fear of the consequences. "This isn't what it looks like," Victoria began, but Thad's voice cut through her words like a blade. "Get out." Victoria tried to maintain her composure, tried to salvage the situation with the same manipulation tactics that had worked on everyone else. But she'd never faced down a Special Forces soldier who'd just discovered his child being systematically tortured. "Thad, you're misunderstanding the situation," she said, backing toward the kitchen door. "Sarah has been having behavioral problems. Sometimes children need firm discipline. I said get out." Thad's voice was quiet, controlled, but it carried the kind of menace that made hardened insurgents surrender without a fight. He stood slowly, keeping Sarah cradled against his chest, his eyes never leaving Victoria's face. "You can't just take her," Victoria protested, desperation creeping into her voice. "I'm her legal guardian. I have papers." "The papers that made you her guardian also made you responsible for her welfare," Thad replied, his words precise and deadly calm. "What I just witnessed isn't guardianship, it's torture. You have 60 seconds to get whatever you absolutely need and leave this house before I call the police." Victoria's facade finally cracked completely. "She's an ungrateful little brat," she snarled. "Do you know how much money I've spent on her? How much trouble she's been? She should be thanking me for keeping her fed and housed." The words hung in the air like poison gas. Sarah whimpered and pressed closer to her father's chest, as if trying to disappear entirely. 50 seconds, Thad said. Victoria grabbed her purse and keys, her movements jerky with panic and rage. At the door, she turned back one final time. "You can't prove anything," she spat. "It's your word against mine." 40 seconds. After Victoria's car screeched out of the driveway, Thad carried Sarah to the living room and sat down with her still in his arms. For several minutes, they just held each other. Father and daughter reunited, but both traumatized by what had been revealed. "I'm sorry, Daddy," Sarah whispered against his shoulder. "I tried to be good. I tried so hard to be good." "Oh, baby girl," Thad said, his voice breaking for the first time. "You didn't do anything wrong. None of this was your fault. Daddy's so sorry he wasn't here to protect you." As he held his daughter, Thad's mind was already working, cataloging evidence and planning his next moves. This wasn't over. This was just the beginning. Over the next hours, as Sarah began to trust that her father was really there, the full scope of abuse emerged. Thad took Sarah to the emergency room, where Dr. Sarah Chen's examination revealed devastating neglect. Sarah was severely malnourished, weighing 32 pounds when she should have weighed 50. Her stomach showed signs of eating non-food substances, and she had multiple vitamin deficiencies. "This child has been systematically starved," Dr. Chen told Thad privately. "She's going to need extensive medical care and psychological support." Back at Victoria's house, accompanied by investigators and police, Thad discovered the true depth of deception. Sarah's room had been converted into Victoria's office. Sarah had been sleeping in the basement on a mattress with no heating. The financial records told their own story. Of the $90,000 Thad had sent, less than $10,000 had been spent on Sarah. The rest funded Victoria's lifestyle: new furniture, expensive clothes, vacations. Detective Maria Santos found detailed records of Victoria's lies on her computer, almost like she'd been proud of her deception. Most damning was a journal documenting her growing resentment and escalating abuse. Victoria had disappeared after leaving the house, but Thad and the authorities were building an airtight case against her. The charges would be extensive: child abuse, child endangerment, fraud, theft, and conspiracy. Thad hired Sarah Morrison, a prosecutor-turned-defense attorney, who specialized in child welfare cases. "We're not just seeking justice for Sarah," Morrison explained during their first meeting. "We're ensuring this can never happen to another child." The evidence was overwhelming, but Victoria had hired an expensive attorney who was already crafting a defense strategy. She would claim that Sarah was a difficult child with behavioral problems, that the abuse claims were exaggerated, that she'd done her best under challenging circumstances. "They'll try to paint her as overwhelmed rather than evil," Morrison warned Thad. "They'll claim she was in over her head, not intentionally cruel. We need to be prepared for a fight." The case attracted media attention when leaked court documents revealed the scope of Victoria's deception. The story of a soldier's daughter being tortured while he served his country struck a nerve with the public. Veterans organizations rallied around Thad and Sarah, offering support and demanding justice. The military also launched its own investigation into how the guardianship arrangement had been approved and monitored. The lack of oversight that had allowed Victoria's abuse to continue unchecked for years became a scandal that reached the highest levels of the Pentagon. The public response to Sarah's story was swift and powerful. Social media campaigns using Justice for Sarah spread across platforms, with thousands sharing their own stories of childhood abuse and the failures of systems meant to protect children. Mrs. Patterson, the neighbor who'd sensed something was wrong, came forward with her observations. "I knew something wasn't right," she told reporters, tears streaming down her face. "I should have done more. I should have called someone." Miss Collins, Sarah's teacher, provided testimony about the changes she'd observed in the child. "The bright, curious little girl who started in my class became increasingly withdrawn and fearful. When I raised concerns, I was told she was just adjusting to her father's deployment." Veterans groups organized fundraisers for Sarah's medical care and therapy. Fellow Special Forces soldiers who'd served with Thad spoke out about the sacrifice military families make and the betrayal Sarah had suffered. The story resonated beyond the military community. Parents across the country looked at their own children and wondered how such horror could happen under everyone's noses. Child welfare organizations used Sarah's case to highlight the need for better oversight of guardianship arrangements and more resources for child protection services. Victoria's trial began 6 months after her arrest. She'd been found hiding in another state, living under an assumed name. The prosecution's case was devastating. Dr. Chen testified about Sarah's condition. Financial experts detailed the theft. Child psychologists explained the trauma. Most powerful was Sarah's testimony. Now 8 and slowly recovering, she took the witness stand with amazing courage. "She told me my daddy didn't love me anymore," Sarah said clearly. "She said I had to eat the kitty sand because I was bad. But I wasn't bad. I just missed my daddy." Victoria's defense tried to portray her as overwhelmed, but the evidence of deliberate cruelty was too strong. The jury deliberated less than 3 hours before returning guilty verdicts on all counts. Judge William Hayes delivered a sentence reflecting the severity: 15 years in prison for child abuse, with additional time for fraud. "You betrayed not only this child but every person who trusted you," he told Victoria. Rebuilding Sarah's life required patience, love, and professional help. Thad left the military to focus on his daughter's recovery. Dr. Amanda Foster, a child trauma specialist, worked with Sarah 3 times weekly. "Children are remarkably resilient," she told Thad, "but healing from this level of abuse takes time. Sarah needs to learn to trust again, feel safe again, believe she's worthy of love." Physical recovery was challenging. Sarah's digestive system had been damaged by malnutrition and eating cat litter. She needed a monitored diet and supplements. Weight gain was slow and required constant medical oversight. Emotional healing was more complex. Sarah suffered nightmares, anxiety, and deep fear that her father would leave again. She hoarded food and panicked if Thad left her sight. "It's normal," Dr. Foster assured them. "Sarah's survival instincts are still activated. She needs time to learn she's truly safe now." Gradually, signs of the old Sarah emerged. She started drawing again, laughing at cartoons, asking for bedtime stories. Every small victory was a triumph over Victoria's cruelty. Sarah's story became a call to action for protecting vulnerable children. Thad and Sarah began speaking at events about their experience. Their message was clear: abuse thrives in silence but cannot survive scrutiny and community involvement. Every adult has a responsibility to protect every child. Thad would tell audiences, "We all need to be watching. We all need to speak up when something doesn't seem right." The military implemented new oversight procedures. Schools received training on recognizing abuse. Communities organized support networks for military families. Sarah, now thriving, had become a symbol of resilience. Her recovery showed that even the worst damage can heal with love, support, and time. "Bad things happened to me," Sarah said during speaking engagements, her voice steady. "But I'm okay now because my daddy came home and people helped us. Every kid deserves to be safe and loved." The little girl who had once been forced to eat cat litter was now helping ensure other children would be protected. Her voice, once silenced by fear, had become a powerful force for justice. Love had triumphed over cruelty, truth over deception. Sarah's story would continue inspiring change, ensuring her suffering had not been in vain. No child should ever have to eat cat litter to survive. But when such horrors occur, Sarah and Thad's story proves recovery is possible. Justice can prevail, and love can overcome even the darkest cruelty.